So I would talk to Christian friends and they would say things like, there's more evidence for the existence of Jesus than anyone else in history. And I would say, really? Like more evidence than JFK? They go, well, no. More evidence than Hitler? No, I mean, in ancient history. They go, really? More evidence than Julius Caesar? They go, yeah, more evidence for Jesus than Julius Caesar. Well, that's obviously not true. We've got copies of Julius Caesar's own writings about his campaigns in Gaul. We've got coins, contemporary coins with his head on them and his name on them. We've got...
So hi, Cameron. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it and enjoyed your film. My question is, what was your inspiration for, making this film and doing this project?
I wanted to spend 4 years of my life preparing something that I would release the night before COVID shut down all the cinemas around the world for the better part of a year and a half. That was the grand plan, and it worked. That part of it worked perfectly. In fact, the screening in my hometown of Brisbane was scheduled. We had a sold-out cinema, and it was literally the day they shut down the cinemas. So that was obviously the Lord getting revenge on me. The backstory is that, as I mentioned in the film, I was raised as a Catholic. I left the church when I was about 8, after I was offended by something I heard the priest say. And but I'm sort of a history nerd, and I've made a living for the last roughly 20 years teaching history on podcasts, and I've always been fascinated with the history of Christianity, how it came to be as powerful as it has been, continues to be around the world. So I read a lot of scholarship over the years, biblical scholarship. I was always trying to keep up to date with biblical scholarship. But I found that when I talked to my Christian family and friends about it, they were completely ignorant of what is basically standard biblical scholarship, and would often accuse me of just making stuff up, or, well, that's just atheists who say that. And I'll go, well, no, actually, most of these biblical scholars are Christians, active believing Christians. They just, they have to be honest with where the scholarship leads them. And if I talked to my atheist friends or other non-Christian friends about the history of Christianity, I get this weird response where a lot of atheists are like, "Oh, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to know about it. I'm not interested in it. I don't believe, so I'm not interested." I always thought that was weird, because I don't believe Julius Caesar was a god either, but most atheists are happy to study Caesar. They don't believe Alexander the Great was a god, and obviously, there were cults built up around both of those guys and Augustus, and yet we're happy to study the history of ancient Greece, ancient Macedon, ancient Rome. For some reason, atheists tend to, unless they're like a really feral kind of atheist who wants to beat up Christians, most of my atheist friends weren't interested in Christian history either. And I think it's fascinating. I mean, it's obviously played a huge role in Western civilization in particular, and you can't really understand the last 2,000 years of Western civilization without understanding the role that Christianity has played in it. So I just thought it would be fun. I hadn't seen a film like this that tried to take a relatively even tone. It's not a beat up. It's also not overly sort of pious in its treatment of Christianity. I just wanted to make something that was a straightforward, hopefully slightly entertaining film that covers the basics of where biblical scholarship is today, in terms of our understanding of how Christianity developed in that first few hundred years, as much as we could fit into an hour and 40 minutes. I mean, the original script was about 10 hours long, and my producer said, no, we'll never be able to screen that anywhere ever. I tried to convince him it would be a good Netflix series, but he didn't have that kind of juice. So yeah, we crammed in as much as we could into an hour and 40.
Cool, thank you. I feel like I mean, I personally understood like generally what Star was, but I learned a lot from the film. So thank you.
Hi, Cameron. It's me, Sohan.
Hi.
I'm interested in learning more about how your views about mythicism might have shifted over the time since you made the film.
Yeah, not really changed much. I mean, my view on mythicism is that I think it's interesting. I think I think guys like Richard Carrier actually make some good points. I think the approach of, I don't know if anyone is really familiar with Richard's work, but he has tried to apply Bayesian reasoning to the study of early Christianity, and I think that's a reasonable approach. The back of the envelope version of that is you're asking yourself, what would we expect to see if Jesus really had existed? What is the evidence that we would expect to have if he really existed at all? Versus what is the evidence that we would expect to see or not see if he was invented? And then you look at the evidence that we have and you basically see, well, which one of the scenarios does the evidence more closely fit? And then you give weightings to the probability of those scenarios. And I think there's a lot of merit in that approach to, any subject where we don't have a lot of evidence, like which is the case for obviously most personages in ancient history. But I've always felt that it's really intellectually dishonest for me to take a position either way. I don't think there's enough evidence to really convince me that Jesus was a historical person. I don't think there's enough evidence to convince me that he wasn't either. So I've always been fairly agnostic on the issue. As an atheist, it doesn't really matter to me, obviously, whether or not he did or didn't exist. As a historian, I find it an interesting question, but I really don't feel like there's enough evidence to put my hand on heart and say I'm going to go with this one or I'm going to go with that one. To me, it's still a relatively open question with arguments that can be made on either side.
And I have one more question, and I just want to let everyone know on the live stream on YouTube, you can, to people who are watching on the live stream, you can post your questions to the YouTube chat. And people who are in the audience, if you don't want to come up here and ask a question, you can use the Slido number here. You can all see it. So 1926871, and you go to slido.com and enter your question there. So I have a question about the scholars that you interviewed. Were there any that, if you could make the film today, were there any additional scholars that you would have liked to have brought on board?
Oh, well, I would happily talk to any scholar that would turn up. When we were in pre-production for the film, I reached out to about 100 scholars, mostly in the US and Australia, which were going to be our two major filming locations, and told them what the project was. Basically, trying to make a secular documentary looking at their standard scholarship around early Christianity. And anyone who said yes, we basically put in the film, if they could make it to our recording dates and locations. But Ehrman was one of the first, I guess, I reached out to. And he said he was too busy. And I said, come on, man, you can take an hour out of your day to come and chat to us. And he said, well, I normally charge an appearance fee for anything like that, and you wouldn't be able to afford me. So I said, well, look, we're coming to your hometown anyway, in North Carolina. tried to convince him to turn up. He still didn't turn up. We were like filming 15 minutes up the road from his house and he still didn't show up. But, so that was slightly disappointing. Elaine Pagels, I really wanted to have. She was interested but couldn't make it to the date. Gary Halberman. There's just a whole bunch of scholars, both Christian and non. Because I guess one of the things I really wanted to try and do, in terms of the scholars that we had, my basic criteria was, one, they had to have a PhD in biblical scholarship or a related field, ancient history with a focus in biblical history, something like that. I didn't want theologians. I didn't want just people that wanted to rant. The only exception I made was David Fitzgerald, who doesn't have a PhD, but he's written a lot of books on the subject. And the original idea was basically was for me to not to be in the film at all and to have him as the person sort of making the narrative points that I wanted to make. But when we got into the editing room, we realized that there was too many narrative points that needed to be made. So we had to go back out and shoot me doing all of the narration stuff. So I didn't want any theologians. I wanted to be PhDs, people that are actually taking a scholarly view of the history. My other criteria was I wanted to be roughly 50-50 Christian and non-Christian in the film, because I didn't want us to open ourselves up to criticisms. Oh, well, they're all atheists, or from the atheists saying they're all Christians. Because what I wanted to demonstrate was this isn't an atheist thing or a Christian thing. This is consensus of biblical scholarship, these positions, whether they're Christians or not Christians. Everyone who's a serious scholar pretty much agrees on most of the things that were communicated in the film, except for the mythicism part, which I put in just for fun, but made sure that I pointed out that it is currently a fringe view, but one that I think has some merit and is worth considering. And of course, if you pay attention to biblical scholarship, you'll know that the vast majority of scholars get really angry, like Mike Bird did, when you bring up mythicism. They really, really get furious about it, which I don't think is very scholarly. I think you basically need to take these arguments on its merits. The level of anger or insultiness that they get, sort of, or the level of dismissiveness that they bring to it, isn't very scholarly, I think, and I find it kind of amusing.
Right. Would anyone like to come up?
Oh, good. Feel free to pull up.
Oh, yeah, we post on Slido already. Okay, actually. And we have a couple of Slido questions on Slido that I'll read it after. Just stand here and speak directly.
Hi. What do biblical scholars think about Torah and Moses? I mean, the Old Testament.
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think generally speaking these days, as I think we mentioned briefly in the film, most biblical scholars who study the Torah, the Old Testament, don't believe it's very historical. There's really no evidence that Moses or Abraham existed. There is textual evidence that most of the books of the prophets were written over a very long period of time, like I'm talking centuries, with different literary styles. One that comes up a lot in talking to Christians is the book of Isaiah. In particular, there's very different literary styles in that book, and they believe that it was written over centuries, cobbled together over centuries. So yeah, it's not taken as an historical document. It's sort of a justification for why this Hebrew Jewish tribe was at various stages oppressed or dominant in the particular region of the Middle East where they swarmed about. It's sort of theological, sociological justification for their history. But, you know, it's fascinating in and of itself to anyone who's interested in history, because yeah, it's one of the oldest books that we have, and it tells a lot about how this particular tribe of people thought about themselves and their neighbors and what was going on in the world, how they explained natural phenomenon to each other, and just the sort of mythological archetypes that they relied upon, like the Great Flood, etc., that they borrowed from other Mesopotamian stories to sort of explain their place in the world. I find it a fascinating document, and I'm always going back and reading it and getting a lot of enjoyment out of talking donkeys and just the violence and the bloodshed and a lot of the crazy ideas that are in it. It's more interesting than most of the Marvel films that come out, or DC films, I'll say that.
Thanks, Cameron. So there's a couple of questions on the Slido application. One is actually a bit like my question, but it's more about content. Was there anything particularly interesting you learned during your research that you weren't able to include in the film?
Oh, yeah, tons. As I said, like the original script was like 8 to 10 hours long, I think. You know, I think the stuff that I would have liked to have included more of is sort of the period between the Gospels and, say, Theodosius, when the Emperor Theodosius I effectively made Christianity the only legal religion in the empire around about 390 CE. That period between, say, the last gospel, say John, circa 100, 110 CE, through to Theodosius is fascinating. I mean, just we touch on it a little bit in the film, but just the breadth of different ideas that Christians had. You know, I think most Christians, and I also think the vast majority of non-Christians as well, have this idea that Christianity kind of formed, you know, it was sort of one unit. And people, you know, argue with me on TikTok and YouTube about this still today all the time, Christians saying there's only ever been one Christianity. It emerged, wholly formed from the words of Jesus, and everyone believed that Jesus was God and he was the Messiah, and that the Gospels were the Gospels and Paul was right, and that's the way it always was and the way it always will be. And of course, the truth is the complete opposite of that. As we point out, I think one of the scholars says in the film, Raphael Latasta, I think, there are many Christianities now. Like my wife grew up in Utah as a good little Mormon girl, and we go back to Utah a lot, and most of her family is still Mormons. So you take the Mormon beliefs and you compare it to the Catholics or the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Protestants or any number of Christian sects or cults today. They have very, very different beliefs. And the same was true in those first couple of 100 years. There was just so many different factions, and some where the differences in their beliefs were relatively minor and theological, some which were bigger, like the Arians versus the Trinitarians. And if you look at Constantine, he flipped back and forth over the course of his life between being a Trinitarian, believing that, you know, there were three entities, Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, or Holy Spirit, and they're all the one, but they're different. Oh, sorry, Siri just started talking to me for some reason. Go away, Siri. Don't interrupt. And the Arians, who believed that Father and Son were different. Constantine flipped between the two. But then you have, obviously, the ones like the Ebionites and the Marcionites and the Gnostics, and a whole range of others that just had completely different beliefs. Like the Marcionites really believed that the God of the Old Testament was an evil God. that he wasn't the God of Jesus. He was an evil God who was sent to destroy the world and cause chaos. He was basically the devil. Yahweh was the devil, and Jesus believed in a different God. Through, it's all of these debates, and then of course, the way that Theodosius basically got blackmailed by the Bishop of Milan to I don't know if you guys know the story, and I won't bore you, but it's fascinating how Theodosius basically got blackmailed by the Bishop of Milan, Ambrose, to make Christianity the only state religion, the only legal religion. There's so many stories. The story about the ascension of Isaiah that Paul told, where Paul basically said in one of his letters that he knew a guy, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Most scholars think he was referring to himself, that went up to the 7th level of heaven and had conversations with Jesus and the angels, and is talking about these spiritual battles that were going on. And then he came back down to earth. All this sort of really weird and crazy stuff that doesn't get talked about much in your average church sermon. Most people are ignorant of. But there's a million stories that I found fascinating that I would love to be able to tell on film one day. We just didn't have time in this one.
Marketing the Messiah too.
Yeah, well, the series on Netflix, that's the big dream, or whatever,
So we have a question from Slido. This is an interesting one. Islam is the fastest growing religion. Will you make a marketing Muhammad movie, or maybe marketing the Prophet movie? It would definitely spice up your life.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, I get that suggestion a lot, usually from Christians who want to see me lose an eye, I think. Look, I am interested in Islam, and I have read quite a few books on the history of Islam, and on some of my podcasts I've talked a lot about the history of Islam, because again, it's very important to understand if you're trying to understand the history of various parts of the world over the last 1,300 years. But my response to that is always, look, I live in a mostly Christian country. All my friends and family mostly either Christians or come from Christian backgrounds. So when I run out of stories to tell about Christianity, then I'll think about Islam or something else. I actually wanted my next film to be about the Mormons, the history of the Mormons, but my wife won't let me. She said it would damage her relationship with her family, which is not something I want to happen. So, yeah. I think I have to stay away from that topic for a while.
If you have a question from a member of the audience, stand here and speak directly.
Hi, my name is Matthew.
Hey, Matthew.
I want to talk about the the historicity of Jesus in terms of what evidence we have. I don't think you went into this, but I'm sure you're aware of it. Right there, we do have texts from the Jewish historian Josephus, which mention at least a Jesus, a James crucifixion. And then there's some controversial stuff that maybe spices up the divinity of Jesus. But then we also have, texts from Jews and rabbis that did not like what Jesus was perceived to be doing. And we have texts from Roman officials who actually probably couldn't give two craps about what Jesus was doing. But what do you say about how does that evidence fit to, was Jesus a real person?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm not sure about anything written by Jewish rabbis, but we have Josephus, as you say. There's two sections in Josephus's writings that get talked about a lot. One is considered by most scholars to be fake because he says that Jesus was the Messiah, and as scholars always point out, well, Josephus being a Jew wouldn't say that, because Jews didn't and don't believe he was the Messiah. And also the writing of it from a literary analysis, a textual analysis perspective, the writing of that line seems to not fit in with the general narrative that he's telling. The other one that he mentions, James, the brother of Jesus, most scholars think is probably legitimate that he did write that. But he's writing this, around about 100 CE, 95 to 100 CE, long time after events had happened. Same with Tacitus, same with Pliny. The Roman sources that we've got, and Josephus, writing decades after Jesus supposedly died, but during a time when Christianity was very much a thing. It had emerged and was, a sort of a growing cult, a bit of an annoyance to the Romans, mostly because they refused to participate in the official sacrifices to the gods. And, from a Roman perspective, they were dangerous to the state by not participating in the traditional sacrifices because you might upset one of the gods. So my take on that is, look, what the question you have to ask as an historian is, what's the veracity of their sources? Tacitus, Pliny, Josephus. What are they basing it on? Now, I happen to study these guys a lot, particularly Tacitus, because I've done hundreds and hundreds of hours of podcasts on the Caesars. I did a whole series that went for about 9 years, from Julius Caesar up to Nero. And Tacitus is one of the major sources that we have for this period. Now, so I know Tacitus quite well. There's a couple of interesting things about Tacitus. Number one is that he's very biased in his telling of the stories. I think it's important to understand that people we think of as these ancient historians didn't approach history the way that we approach history today. They weren't scholars trying to write a post-Enlightenment, unbiased, neutral history. By the way, most history books that come out today don't meet those objectives either. Everyone has their own biases and their own cognitive biases when they're writing stuff. But these guys weren't trying to do that. They were trying to tell stories. They were writing more, what's a good analogy? It was a good time read. Tacitus is very, very, he hates women, particularly powerful women. He hates certain people with a vehemence that isn't very scholarly, from Tiberius through to Caligula and Nero. So my point being that these guys weren't going, I think there's this mistaken idea that guys like Tacitus were referring to official records somewhere deep in the bowels of Rome and crafting these scientifically accurate stories of who existed and what they did. That's just not the case. And all scholars will agree on this. That's not how these guys wrote their stories. They based it on what they'd heard, or quite often they based it on other books that had been written that had come before them. So the question with these guys is, when they talk about Jesus, are they basing it on historical facts that they had access to primary sources? They never say that, they never quote their sources. So, we can't say that that is the case with any evidence. Or alternatively, are they just passing on anecdotal stories that they've heard? Now, we know that by the time they were writing, there were plenty of stories going around about Jesus. And, I'm sure a guy like Tacitus, who was not just an historian, but a senior official in the Roman at various emperors' administrations, late in the 1st century, early in the 2nd century, were going out and saying, okay, well, who are these Christians and what do they believe? And people would tell them, well, they believe that there was this guy who's called Jesus and he was the founder, and they would run with that. I mean, that's as good as any story. So it's very hard to put your hand on your heart and say these guys are talking about facts. Is it evidence that Jesus existed? Maybe. To me, it's more evidence that people believed that Jesus existed and they were telling those stories. That's not really very hard evidence. In fact, it's pretty flimsy in terms of evidence. You know, one of the things that got me interested in Christian history in the first place 30 odd years ago was I would talk to Christian friends and they would say things like, there's more evidence for the existence of Jesus than anyone else in history. And I would say, really? Like more evidence than JFK? They go, well, no. Oh, more evidence than Hitler? No, I mean, in ancient history. They go, really? More evidence than Julius Caesar? They go, yeah, more evidence for Jesus than Julius Caesar. I go, well, that's obviously not true. We've got copies of Julius Caesar's own writings about his campaigns in Gaul. We've got coins, contemporary coins with his head on them and his name on them. We've got the same, we don't have anything that Alexander the Great wrote, but we have contemporary stelas from Babylon that mention Alexander the Great. Oh, Alexander the Great was here last week, came through with his army, tore the place up. We've got coins with Alexander's head and face, contemporary coins. So, you know, there's a big difference from a historian's perspective between primary evidence and secondary and tertiary evidence. And the bottom line is we just don't have any primary evidence for Jesus, not one contemporary account, not one eyewitness account, not even people. I mean, you could maybe say Paul's somebody who knew people who said they knew Jesus. So he might be a secondary witness, but Paul's credibility is not great as a unbiased historical source. So you have to take everything that Paul says with a grain of salt. So anyway, I hope that answers the question. So those things are great and they're worth reading, and you have to treat them as something, but they're not very strong in terms of, you know, hard historical evidence, in my opinion.
Right, thanks, Cameron. And one last question from Slido. What was the most unexpected history you found of one of the other New Testament books? For example, the book of Revelation.
Oh, well, I mean, the book of Revelation isn't, you know, anything that you can get anything historical out of. I mean, the most interesting part of that for me is the supposed, you know, the 666, which historians now think is probably 616, which was supposedly an encoded reference to the Emperor Nero. And this fear that they had that Nero would come back. I mean, Revelation, written by the same author as the Gospel of John, supposedly, and the Johannine epistles. And, you know, so written probably late first century, early second century, so a good 40, 50 years after Nero had died. And there's this suggestion that, you know, the great beast that they were scared that was going to come back was Nero. Now, the thing that I find fascinating about that is because I've done a lot of work on Nero. I did a podcast on Nero that went for about 50 hours, something like that. It took a year or a year and a half talking about Nero on my Caesar show. And, you know, Nero wasn't a monster. You know, this perception that we have of Nero that's come down to us mostly from Christians about him being this psychopath, brutal monster of a human being isn't backed up by the primary sources. You know, I feel sorry for Nero, really. Nero was a kid that was thrust into power very young with a very dominating mother who wouldn't let him marry the slave girl that he was in love with. And, you know, he had some good mentors early on, like Seneca, who abandoned him after the first sort of 5 years. But he was in a terrible situation. I mean, Rome was a mess. He was a kid. He didn't know what he was doing. There was these huge expectations. And really, he was a poet and an artist. All he wanted to do was go on stage and sing and dance and perform plays. He had the soul of this great artist. That's all he wanted to do was party, get laid, drink, and perform on stage. That and you know, the elite, particularly guys like Tacitus decades later, frowned upon that, because that is not how a member of the Roman elite should conduct themselves. I mean, it's basically, I mean, imagine Joe Biden dressing up in drag every weekend and hitting drag clubs and doing songs from Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, how that would go down with the establishment. That's basically Nero, but he was 20, not 112 or whatever Biden is now. So he was beaten up by the Roman elite and establishment for not fitting the mold of what a good member of the Roman elite, let alone the emperor, should be, how he should conduct himself. Anyway, you know, and there's this whole story that he supposedly oppressed Christians after the Great Fire of Rome. There's no evidence to support that either. You know, I agree with an Australian scholar, Stephen Dando Collins, who says that if you read the source material, it was probably the cult of Isis that Nero blamed for the fire. There's good evidence, textual evidence, that points to the cult of Isis, not the cult of Christianity, that he probably blamed. And good reasons, because he had been a member of the cult of Isis, and they kind of, he had left after they promised him they could save his beloved wife from dying, and she died anyway. And so he was angry and he wanted to punish the cult of Isis, etc., etc. But the Christians had this great fear that he was going to return, and they sort of positioned him as the Antichrist. And, you know, not only Jesus could come back, didn't, but could have, will one day, any day now. It's just a matter of time. But they thought Nero was going to come back too. Now, they believed that Jesus was going to come back because he was favored by Yahweh, but how's Nero coming back? Well, how does that work? Who's bringing Nero back from the dead to terrorize them? I mean, there's like Revelation is like it's a mad, like a lot of the New Testament is mad and crazy stuff. You know, like Paul fantasizing about these super apostles castrating themselves and all this kind of stuff. It's wild and crazy stuff, but Revelation just takes it to a whole new level. And you got to read it and the Gospel according to John as like bookends. Like as we sort of briefly touch on in the film, the Gospel according to John is wildly different from the synoptic Gospels. It paints this completely different picture of Jesus. As we say in the film, you know, if you go back to the first gospel, Mark, Jesus is walking around basically saying, "Shh, don't tell anyone about me. I don't want anyone to know who I am. Keep it a big secret. I'm not going to tell the masses my true secret. I'm going to tell you 12 guys. Don't tell anyone. This is just between you, me, and the doorpost." By the time you get to John, Jesus is basically walking around saying, "I'm God. Everyone sit down, shut up, listen to me. I've come to save the world." Like, these are two different characters. And trying to figure out how they plug together in a jigsaw puzzle is a lot of fun. But then, you know, John goes from completely reinventing the Jesus story on one hand to coming up with this fever dream of Revelation, which is just madness on steroids. It's like like a David Lynch film. You know, it's fascinating stuff. But yeah, my wife. I spent years preparing for this film, lying in bed late at night, reading the Bible, and my wife just scratching her head and going, "What are you laughing about now?" And I have to tell her these stories that I was reading. She thought I was mad, just lying there reading the Bible constantly every night. But it's fun. It's a great read. By the way, getting back to Tacitus just briefly, if you haven't read Tacitus, read Tacitus. Tacitus is a great writer. Like, if he really was a great writer. I love reading. Oh, the other interesting thing about Tacitus and Jesus, by the way, to get back to the other chap's question, Matthew's question. Funnily, coincidentally, maybe, like, there's two big question marks when you go back and read this period. Number one is, as we briefly touch on in the film, where are all the writings of the non-Pauline apostles? Where are the letters of Peter? Where are the letters of James? Where are the Gospels of Peter and James? The people who actually knew Jesus. There's nothing. Now, you have to think, this gets back to Richard Carrier's Bayesian logic with this. You would have to think if Jesus existed and these guys knew him and they were building these churches as they were, and it was as big a deal to these early Christians as we believe, some of those writings would have survived. The writings of Peter, the writings of James, their gospels, their stories, their accounts. Okay, probably they were illiterate, but they would have had access to people in their communities who were literate, and they would have had scribes, you would assume. We know that letters existed from people other than Paul because Paul talks about them. And, you know, in his letters to the Corinthians and Galatians, he says, you just got this letter and it's teaching you stuff that's against my teaching. Don't listen to those guys. Where are those letters? What happened to them? There's this big gap. You have to wonder, well, did they just not make it? Like, because most stuff written 2,000 years ago hasn't survived. I think the estimate I read a while back is we have about 1% of the literary material that existed 2,000 years ago survives today. And most of that is Cicero and a little bit of Aristotle and a little bit of Plato, because the Christians kept that. They made copies of that during the Middle Ages, but everything else just disappeared. Or was it deliberately disappeared like the non-canonical Gospels they tried to get rid of, because they ran counter to the story that the winning faction, the Pauline faction, wanted to tell. And then getting back to Tacitus, coincidentally, Tacitus's writings, go from Julius Caesar through Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. But the section around about the Caligula time frame, when Jesus was supposedly walking around doing his thing, is gone. It's never been found. There's a gap. There's about a 10-year gap in Tacitus that happens to coincide with this period of like 30 to 40 CE. It's about 30 to 36, actually. It's the Jesus years, the years of Tacitus that are missing. So, you look at that gap, you look at the gap of the Peter and James guys, and you go, well, coincidence, maybe, yeah, possibly, or deliberate. These things deliberately been just excised from the history of Christianity. We'll probably never know. I don't think I even answered the question. I think I did. Anyway.
All right. Thank you so much, Cameron, for the Q&A. Really appreciate it, as well as, the rights to screen the film. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for taking an interest in the film. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Have a good night, guys.
Yep. Good morning for you.
Cheers.